Good morning. It's my pleasure to be with you all this morning. It's impressive to see what you've put together to address clearly a topic that is not just of national but also of global importance. And what I wanted to do in the next 15 minutes or so is try to put the challenge in a bit of a historic as well as of a global perspective. And point in the direction of some of the solutions that we believe are going to help us deal with the challenge. And when you look at the agenda of the conference, you actually see that there's many of these areas that are going to be addressed. So I'm sure you're in for a couple of valuable hours today. Let me get started. Can we move to page number 1? What we have tried to do here on this page is show you the impressive growth that plastics have gone through globally, and this goes back to 1965. And since 1965 through, I would say, the versatility, the cost performance, and the durability of plastics as a material in many applications, it's grown 25-fold. And if you were to analyze where that growth is coming from, it predominantly comes from the increasing importance it plays in everyday life. Population growth as such has driven it by a factor of 2, but what has driven really plastics to the forefront as one of the most important materials in our society is the fact that we're using about 10 times more than we did in 1965. If we move to the next page, you can see where this growth is coming from. And as I said, the versatility of plastics makes that it is not just a single application area that is responsible for this phenomenal growth. It is a combination of end uses in everyday life, whether it's in construction, in transportation, in packaging or in electronics, but also in other areas like healthcare and medical, agriculture, pharmaceutical. I think a modern society will not exist, does not function without plastics in its many shapes and forms. Now, this phenomenal growth of plastics has also provided us with a challenge, and that is what to do with plastics post-use. And in all fairness, the way we deal with plastic post-use and the volumes that we're able to treat effectively as a society today have not kept up with this phenomenal growth of the use. And forgive me for the somewhat complicated chart, but I would say the takeaway here is that by and large today's plastic value chain is linear. Yeah. So at a global level today, we're probably effectively recycling about 10 to 15%. With the other 85% of plastics either ending up as energy source, ending up in landfill, or, and this is, I would say, the particular challenging area, it leaves the value chain in an unmanaged fashion and frankly provides plastics with a challenging reputation, and we all know the images, and I'm sure you're aware of the challenge. So a fantastic material that plays an important role in society, will continue to do so, but a challenge on a value chain that has a essentially linear characteristic. So the question posed, obviously, what is it that we're going to do? And if we move to the next chart, we see how we think about the transition to a much more circular value chain. And we believe that end of the day, this transition to a circular value chain, and I'll share some of the examples after this page, comes from 4 interconnected elements. I think first of all, we need to rethink how we design and use plastics. we need to make sure that the materials that we design using plastics are better suited for recycling, which means they probably need to be simpler and really conceived with a notion of the different recycling techniques that allow recovery. We also need to be smarter about how we use plastics. We may need to use less in specific applications. We may need to look for smart trade-offs between plastics and other materials and other applications, but there's a whole set of things we can do to better design and use plastics. I think the second key factor is we need to get more effective in how we recover plastics post-use. And you recall the chart that I just shown. In many places, cities, countries of the world, the plastic waste management system is not yet up to a level where we can start to think about the third element of this chart, which is the recycling. Yeah. In Europe, where I spent most of my time, I would say we're trying to accelerate what we can do on the recycling front, but in many cases, we're simply limited by the availability of high quality plastic waste to start that recycling point. So I would say critical element to bring together between smarter design and use and implementing the recycling technologies, whether this is mechanical or advanced recycling or other technologies, is this facilitating the loop by having effective recovery and effective waste management. And then I would say the final point that we put in the middle here is what we describe as investable economics, which means we need to make sure that somehow, like the production of virgin, this is economically self-propelling, and that means we need to attract the investors that are willing to build up these systems and scale. And we also need to provide the incentives that ensure that we scale to a level where we're not just recycling 15%, but where we're really getting up to the high levels of recycling that we need to establish a fully circular economy. Let me quickly show some of the positive signs of activity around the world from a multitude of stakeholders, because as you can imagine, as we want to transition to this circular model, we're sure going to need all players along the value chain. Let me move to the next page. I think what you can see here is a map of the world, and it's color-coded to show the nature of interventions that policymakers and governments are taking to make sure that we use plastics effectively. And that means stimulating the use, reducing the use, as well as banning it from uses that inherently pose significant problems because they are difficult to recover later on. Now, obviously, the next wave is going to be how do you, beyond these effective but relatively simple measures, also implement more sophisticated measures on incenting, as I talked about, the scaling of the circular economy. I would say the jury is still out. Many models are being tested around the world, but we will for sure see more progress as regulators, policymakers play their role in making the value chain more circular. If we move to the next chart, we can see the perspective from the end users or the consumers. What we did here is we've analyzed the pledges, as we like to describe them, of 250 consumer companies, both fast-moving and durables, in their aspirations for making their products more circular. And you can see the kind of commitments that they're posing, whether this is relating to reducing material, improving the recyclability of the packaging materials they use, increasing the recycled content, as well as thinking about driving up the bio or renewable content of their product. So you can see clearly from the customers of the chemical industry, there's a huge push to try and work towards a more circular economy. And then finally, if I move to my third example on the next page, you can see some of the initiatives being taken by companies like GC and your peers in the industry. I think it's great to see that not only people are setting targets and making investments, and you can see the companies on the left, players in the petrochemical and broader chemical industry are all committing to significant quantitative targets on how much recycling material they will put in their value chains, as well as working together in alliances and ventures to drive the nature or the kind of innovation that we need to become more circular. So I would say from a linear starting point, I think there's a clear recognition that we need to get more circular. I think it's positive to see the activity from different stakeholders to drive into that direction, whether it's the regulators, the customers, as well as the industry itself. Let me wrap up on a couple of thoughts that you can take into the next sessions of today. Can we move to the next page? If we step back from what I just shared, what do we believe are some of the success factors, key considerations, core questions that we need to answer? And I was looking at the agenda again this morning. I think you will see many of the things that I've listed on this page here are being dealt with in the very rich agenda that is ahead of you. I think innovation is going to play an important part, right? And this is both in how we think about the plastics that we use, but it is also about the products that we use. And I think this will provide an important driver for a more circular model as we design for recycling, not just at the product level, but also, for instance, in how we think about packaging concepts, recycling loop concept, closed loop concepts that are more circular from the start. I think the second very important point, and probably the one that is less, or that gets the least attention today, is as we transition to this circular economy, and in that sense it is not any different from the energy transition that our colleagues in the oil and gas sector are going through, this will require a very significant amount of investment. We need to invest in the collection systems, we need to invest in the recycling systems. This all needs to be integrated with the existing industry as we know it, and this will require very significant investment, and we will need to continue to invest in this as the plastics consumption grows globally. And this means we need to attract and coordinate the right investor groups that can make this transition possible. This is a thing that we can probably not just do from the chemical industry as such, but this will require the collaboration with financial investors, infrastructure investors, to make this transition possible. As we have, on my third point, created a very successful global plastics industry where players like GC and many of your peers can participate in your country, but also effectively export and participate in global markets, has also made the circular value chain and the challenges to get there a sort of an international and global challenge. And that means we need to make sure that companies and players can collaborate easily across borders, cannot just solve the problem at the national level. And that means we will need regulatory frameworks and incentives that are at least globally compatible. I'm not sure that we need global standards for everything, but we need to make sure that differences in how governments think about circularity and recycling don't lead to the wrong kind of behavior or an attractiveness to move waste from one country to the other. I think we should create a level playing field where collaboration is facilitated between the different players. And I would say, as a final point, we all as consumers and citizens have an important role to play, in particular in how we use plastics, but also because we're in many cases the start of the circular loop as we get rid of the plastics products after use. And again, I think we collectively have a great role to play to explain the importance of what we all do as consumers, and also enlist us all as consumers in dealing with the challenge and the opportunity of moving to a circular value chain. With that, I wish you a very productive rest of your day. Thanks for inviting me. It was a pleasure and an honor to be with you this morning.